All right. So we're a bit ahead of time, but we're just gonna proceed with the program and then have a longer break, right, after more Q&A. So right now I'm very honored to introduce Craig Callender, who will be the first opening keynote. Unfortunately, he won't be here in person, but very glad that he is at least able to make it online here. Right. So briefly introduce, and probably most of you have heard of Craig before. Craig Callender is a Tata Chancellor Professor of Philosophy and a founding faculty and co-director of the Institute of Practical Ethics. He's also the president of the Philosophy of Science Association, and from 2019 to 2022, sat on the Freedom and Responsibility in Science Committee of the International Science Council. His main area of research and teaching is philosophy of science, ranging from the nature of time and to various applied social and ethical issues. He obtained his PhD in Rutgers at the station on quantum mechanics and direction of time, and recently his book, What Makes Time Special, won the 2018 Lakatos Award and the 2022 Soupes Prize. So more personally as well, Craig was my advisor, and honestly, without him, I wouldn't be possible here. So I'm very, very happy to be able to introduce him here as the first keynote of the APSA. So without any delay, Craig, please go ahead and begin.
Okay, thank you so much. Um, Let me first say something, as president of the Philosophy of Science Association, and then I'll jump into my talk. But first, I should say I'm so sorry that I'm not there. I have had a serious health issue, and so that's kept me from going. But I wish I could go. I really wish I was there. Um, But as president of the PSA, I just want to congratulate you on the beginning and the birth of the APSA. As most philosophers of science are somewhat isolated. They're typically in philosophy departments, humanities departments, and you don't have typically we don't have that many colleagues to bump into. And so it's really super important, and why I've been so passionate about the PSA because it does promote and foster all these collaborations that are so important. I mean, I suppose most people at most eras think this, but I do think philosophy of science is especially important today. I mean, when you look around at the world, you see people who are overly credulous in science and not credulous enough. And so we philosophers of science try to walk that path in between the two. And so I think it's a very important discipline, and so it's really crucial to support it. And I know the value of the meetings, so I think the meetings have been central in my life. So I can remember, for instance, I can remember in 1998, probably that's when I met Shuang giving a talk on phase transitions. That talk on phase transitions then led to a paper with Tarun Menon, whom I think is there, or was there at least on Facebook when I saw it the other yesterday. Um, and then also Shuang's work. Then I then mentioned to Eugene, who then ended up working on relativistic thermodynamics. And so you see all these sort of network of connections flowing out just from one brief encounter at one PSA. But I'm old and I've been to PSA since 1994, and so I have many stories like this all over the place. And so hopefully you all will have that as well. You'll be able to say you were at the first APSA, and that's amazing. I should also mention that um, this has been a good month for new PSAs because last week the Brazilian PSA kicked off. So this is an amazing, great achievement in both places. Okay, so let me share my screen. Uh, oh, sorry. Can you see that? Yeah. Okay, and you can hear me okay? Okay. Eugene, is it okay if I go? Oh, I don't hear you.
Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so I'm not going to give a. I'm going to. Eugene mentioned that I did, you know, think more applied philosophy of science, and so I've been working a lot on disinformation lately. And you'll see an extra reason in the talk for why I wanted to be in Singapore now. But what I want to talk about is the title is A Life Cycle of a Life Cycle Analysis, Preprints, Press Releases, and Policy. And, as most cases of disinformation, it looks sort of like this. You've got a kind of vested interest, a kind of company and industry. So, famously, the big tobacco companies like Philip Morris, they would then hire various scientists. And even if the scientists weren't knowingly, getting the research outcomes that tobacco wanted, still we know that there are all these different kind of funding effects that can happen, and that they really did serve to delay regulation on tobacco. And so you could read about this in, the great historians of science's work, Robert Proctor. Other cases, fossil fuel industry. So, a case I know well is this Chevron, BP, and I think something like 15 other companies funding MIT. They fund a white paper called The Future of Natural Gas that then really does lead to the fracking bonanza in some way. It's not the only reason, but it was a reason. That case is not in The Merchants of Doubt by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway, but it's the sort of thing that gets discussed there. In other cases, Johns Manville, Union Carbide, do the same thing, sort of sabotage the science of asbestos, and it really becomes a public health disaster, just like in the case of tobacco and climate change. And you end up having delayed regulation. And so you can read about this in, David Rosner, who unfortunately just died, and Jerry Markowitz's book, Deadly Dust. Another case is the Cattlemen Association. They fund very close to home here because I'm at UC San Diego, UC Davis. They fund the UC Davis Clear Center. And, very straightforwardly, they basically the UC Davis Clear Center basically acts as a kind of public relations unit for the Cattlemen's Association. And one of the main things they do is they distort and create a lot of uncertainty about the climate footprint of beef agriculture. And so that's a lot of that is in work by my friend Jennifer Jacquet. So today, what I want to do is talk about a different sort of case. Here, you are not going to have the actor on the left side, really. You could argue with me and say, in some sense, there is the actor on the left side, but it's not the same. I think you'll agree. So what I want to do is try to show how the toxic ecosystem, lacking any strong corporate vested interest, can lead to similar policy affecting polluted landscapes. Um, and so this especially bothers me because I work in a university, I work at a academic society, and our mission is the production of knowledge that's independent knowledge that's useful for society. And we shouldn't go around producing epistemic pollution to the detriment of public health. And yet that's what we often end up doing. And so I'm going to show how an action that you might not have thought about before, the university press release, can be a potent ingredient in brewing a stew of misinformation. And so the epistemically polluted landscape will look just the same, as you'll see, as if they were a Philip Morris or an Exxon or somebody like that, a puppet master behind the scenes. Yeah, in this case, it doesn't seem like there is a puppet master behind the scenes. And I'm also going to do this with a case coming from UC Davis, and so you can compare it directly with what happens at the Clear Center. And then, so I'm going to argue that the press release, a particular press release, so that's the life cycle. Well, there's a press release that's a life cycle analysis. That's what you call a kind of detailed study of the climate impact of a particular product. And we're going to look at a life cycle analysis of a life cycle analysis. And I'm going to say that the press release that UC Davis put out was basically like putting a match on a tinderbox. And then, oh, something's gone wrong with my slide there. But I'll then end with some reasons for some practical actions that we could take to maybe try to, stem this kind of, not end, but limit this kind of thing. So we're going to talk about this particular study from UC Davis in 2023. It was put up on the bioRxiv, which is the main archive for biology, on April 21st. New Scientist then wrote an article about it on May 9th. UC Davis then put out a press release on the 22nd. And then on the 23rd, it goes everywhere and then will affect policy in some way. Um, and what I want to do is show how, the what happened after New Scientist wasn't really so bad. But what really changes everything is what happens on May 23rd. So I want to show how it will, in some sense, irreversibly pollute the epistemic landscape. And then so much so that even if you're sort of just a reasonable, epistemically responsible inquirer, and you just look around on this issue to see what's going on, you would believe the completely terrible, terrible claims that come out of this. And so it makes it that much easier to then affect public policy. And I will then show how this preprint directly affects public policy. So what am I going to talk about? So the preprint is about the climate footprint of cultivated meat. So cultivated meat, sometimes called lab-grown meat, cellular meat. It has all sorts of different names. The people in the business don't like it being called lab-grown meat. Cultivated meat is probably the best term. And really, what you do is for cultivated meat, you take sampling of some tissue from an animal. On this picture, it says muscle tissue, but it doesn't have to be muscle tissue. It could be just skin. And then you extract stem cells, add a nutrient medium, and then growth factors. And basically, you spin this up and then create different sorts of types of um, muscle and things like that, different types of cells, assemble that into cultivated meat as the final product. And so all of this is happening there. So if you look on the picture down in the lower right, there's a bioreactor. The bioreactor is going to be, it gets plugged in to an electric grid and, would demand a lot of energy. Now, cultivated meat, you generally can't buy it, but, it is a sort of, when we look at the world's uh, population growing, it's clear when you look at the numbers that we can't sustain the current food production structure for too much longer. Something has to give, something has to go. And so one sort of, possibility to explore would be creating meat in the lab. I shouldn't have called it lab-grown meat, but it could be cultivated meat. And so you can make cultivated meat of any type of animal in principle. And then people who are work behind it also point out that you have massive animal welfare gains. So instead of all the factory farms and slaughterhouses and all the agony and suffering that the animals have to endure, here you just take some skin or a little bit of tissue and really don't need it again and again. So you have a huge gains in terms of animal welfare. But then also in terms of climate footprint, so the climate footprint of agriculture, well, it's very contested, but it's, somewhere around 15% to 20%. You see different sorts of estimates of global carbon emissions. And so and then most of that is beef. So beef is way more carbon intensive than chicken and pork and other things. And so cultivated meat seems to have a lot going for it potentially. Could be good for the environment, good for animals, good for us. A good way of getting protein. And so then the big question is whether it can be scaled up. Answer, don't know yet. So many groups are working on this. But it has been already co-opted into a wider culture war. Uh, so when you think about especially, U.S. politics, then yeah, but also European and elsewhere, you'll see, different sides pop up about some who don't care about animal welfare gains, don't care about climate change, and they also look at this and with horror. One of the big funders behind it is Bill Gates. And so it grabs like every single sort of cultural meme that's important in the US but other places as well, and triggers people into one way or the other. And so it's already immersed in this massive kind of culture war, even though it's you can't really buy it yet. And we know we have a huge problem, and that maybe this is a good partial solution. Here's one of the extra reasons I wanted to come to Singapore. This is the only place you can really buy it. You can go to Huber's Butchery and Bistro. There I put on a map and you can see how to get there. It's 19 minutes from where you're sitting. So you can go there and you can buy cultivated chicken product. It's only like 2% cultivated chicken product mixed with other things. You can also buy dog food in the UK that has some mixed in. Um, the proponents aren't really thinking that it's going to replace like a fine steak at a French restaurant, but they're thinking, for things like hot dogs, meatballs, and other sort of more processed foods that could easily take the place of that. Anyway, back to the story. So there's a so the preprint. It's by Reasoner et al. And it's called Environmental Impacts of Cultured Meat: A Cradle to Gate Life Cycle Assessment. And so this comes out, just before the Diana Rogers, the influencer and nutritionist, said, "I'd rather eat my shoe than lab-grown meat." I've yet to see a life cycle assessment on the production of it. And then she would have loved this one because this one was gonna, make her day. First, though, let me back up and say, when you're trying to do the climate impact of cultivated meat or anything in agriculture, it's very tricky because you don't really have like for like. So the main source of climate change from agriculture is methane, has different lifetime. And so there's many arguments about using different metrics and so you'll see CO2 50, CO2 100, and they each of these metrics can be used in a legitimate way, but they're often being used to game the system in some way. Anyway, so the best thing you do is give it like a full picture of it all. But for these sorts of things that everyone just translates everything into what's called CO2 equivalent. And so everything's going to be CO2 equivalent per kilogram of meat. So then you can, if so, so it's a little bit like an art, but more also a bit like science, where you're going to push, try to translate, what's the climate impact of beef, what's the climate impact of pork, chicken, soybeans, and cultivated meat. Throw it all into this metric, and there already were many different life cycle analyses. And so let me explain things here for you. So what Reasoner et al. Do is they use, so look at the big number at the bottom there. They use how much does regular beef agriculture, how much CO2 gets put up, CO2 equivalent gets put up per kilogram of meat. Answer, according to them, 60 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of meat. That's beef. Okay. Now, 60 is not such a bad choice. So if you Google it, you'll often find 100, but I have seen as low as like 40, 45. So 60 is sort of maybe not so bad. And now if we look at the previous life cycle analyses, so then what you're doing now, the ones at the top are um, of cultivated meat. And so you'll see they'll have a range, they'll have different scenarios. And so you'll see like the first one there in 2011, it's 1.89 to 2.24. Those are both way, 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 way lower than 60. That's sort of what you might expect. All you're having to do is plug in the bioreactor, really. You don't have all the cows farting methane and all the tractors and land use changes and water use changes and all the transportation and all of that stuff. And so you'd expect it to be pretty small. And so you look down and then you'll start to see a couple that are bigger, the Smentana, they get 24. Tuamisto, their third one there, it gets a high end of 25. So you sometimes get these high ends. But now the UC Davis one, the Reasoner, they run six scenarios, three um, without without purifying the process to pharmaceutical grade, and three with purifying the process to pharmaceutical grade. Now look at those numbers. 1,508 the upper end in their model. And so they say in their paper that cultivated meat that could have a climate footprint of 25 times greater than beef agriculture. Now, when I saw this, I thought this is crazy. On its face, it seems crazy when you think of how much goes into beef agriculture. And it's just so far off. So, like I have Grover there saying one of these is not like the others. I mean, 1,508 versus the others, which are really very tiny. So, well, what's going on? Well, here's my best sort of analysis of what's going on. Well, the first main thing, and other people have pointed this out, not just me, um, the assumption of pharmaceutical grade. So, when you're doing, the media can be filtered to different extents. And filtration means, spinning lots of things and pushing lots of volumes of things through nets and, centrifuges and things like this, all very energy intensive. Well, that assumption drives up the CO2 estimate for cultivated meat by 20 times. And that might be true of current production, although it's not really because already Mosa meat in 2023 could do it without. But the thing that's striking is that it's a presupposition of this technology scaling up that the media switches to mostly food grade. Everyone in the field assumes that. So the conditional, if production continues to use pharmaceutical grade media, what is its climate impact when scaled up, is the wrong question to ask. Because if production continues to use pharmaceutical grade media, then cultivated meat isn't going to be a thing. It's just not going to be viable. Everyone knows that and has accepted that all along. And so it's a kind of weird thing to look at those three scenarios with the purification. Also, when they then estimate the global warming potential, it's kind of odd. They're very the chemistry here is complicated, and so they look at like the chemical production of another very complicated molecule, and then they use the global warming potential that was from that for this, even though it has nothing to do with this. Moreover, they use this particular data set that corresponds to Western Europe's electricity mix in 2007, 2010. But of course, the EU grid intensity is now about half or less 2010 values. In California, where I live, it's a third. So by my calculations, using a cleaner grid would cut the CO2 estimate by 25% or more. There's also other complaints you could have about the paper. You could say that, the title refers to environmental impacts, but doesn't consider most of them, like deforestation, water use diversion, pollution, etc. And when they write, and here's a thing that I want you to focus on for a second, because they'll come up maybe once or twice later. At some point, at the end, and then it gets picked up later, They rate that all scenarios are worse for cultivated meat than beef. Um, and so when they do that, they switch from the median impact of beef to the minimum. So over here, it was 60. Then over here, it's 9.6. And then they don't explain that. And they get it from this paper. And I looked at that paper, and that paper is just a survey of thousands and thousands of places. And it doesn't say anything about the details. It could be just like somebody's backyard with one cow, for all we know. So not really a legit thing to switch to the minimum there. Even if you look at like the most amazing, so when people work on this, they look, how can we get lower than 60? If you look at, if you just put in just tons and tons, scores of massively transformative things, you could maybe imagine getting down to around 20 CO2 equivalent per kilogram. But then, it's kind of weird then that the paper, allows beef to improve, but not cultivated meat. Okay, so now May 9th, New Scientist comes out, writes this paper, lab-grown meat could be 25 times worse for climate than beef. So it's a for-profit magazine. The preprint, remember, has not been published or peer-reviewed yet. At this point, the paper gets this article then attracts attention. And so one of Trump's sons tweets about it and a few other things. But if you think it's sort of like the swamp and the culture wars picks it up. And so it doesn't really go into outside the swamp. It stays there kind of. There's not really any penetration in mainstream or legacy media. However, everything is about to change. Now along comes UC Davis, the UC Davis Media Office. They put out this on May 22nd. Lab-grown meat's carbon footprint potentially worse than retail beef. So they don't do the 25 times, but they say potentially. And but it still seems to be a bit skewed because I mean, given the studies, the title could have been lab-grown meat's carbon footprint potentially 68% lower than retail beef, depending on which scenario they pick up. They don't do any interviews from for outside perspective. They don't highlight how serious the limitation to pharmaceutical grade is. And moreover, in here, I note this, uh, they add investments to advance more climate-friendly beef production may yield greater reductions in emissions more quickly than investments in cultured meat. Well, where did they get that? That's not the subject of the paper. That's the press officer bouncing off that median to minimum switch at best. And so it's just completely hype generated by um, the press officer. And so the paper itself has some hype. At the end, it says all scenarios are worse, where it does this clever bait and switch with the median and the minimum. The press release is then filled with hype as well. And here, I should stress also that Reasoner et al., those authors, do not seem to be getting money, unlike in the Clear Center at Davis, across the hall from them, do not seem to be getting money from Cattlemen Association or any of the big um, enemies of cultivated meat. Okay, then May 23rd comes, so the preprint goes out on May 22nd. On the 23rd, it goes viral. Um, and it becomes a significant piece in undermining one of cultivated meat's main benefits, low climate emissions. How do I know this? Well, because I exhaustively went through in a kind of unscientific way because I was really just looking for everything. And so I collected, oh, I can't even see my own thing. My Zoom thing is over it. What is that? 426 news items or something like that. So I called them from LexisNexis, Altmetric, Google, and ChatGPT. Found all of these that refer to basically looking for keywords like, that the climate footprint is 25 times worse, things like that, and would find them all over the world. And then only 6% of these 400 and something are nuanced or critical of the reason or study. And you can then see it really it was really massive what happened. So the altmetric score was 2510, which is massively high. If you're a philosopher, you can look at your papers and see what your altmetric score is. And I guarantee you it is not that high. It was previously in the top 5% of articles shared, the number 8 read from the BioArt archive, and had a top 1% attention score among articles the same age. Here in this picture from Altmetric, the blue line is the well, tweets and stuff, and you can see right around May. If we zoomed in, we'd see that May, that there's like a little incline after the New Scientist paper, and then it goes sharply up after the UC Davis thing press release. Um, Also, sometimes it's good to be lucky. So it just so happened that Changing Markets had commissioned Ripple Research to review over 285 million digital posts, mostly on X, related to meat and dairy. And just so happened it was overlapped the time I was interested in. And so then they have their report, and they identify different loci of peaks of misinformation and disinformation. And there you'll see May 23rd, May 26th, May 28th is sort of the peak, so it took a little while, and there you can see they identify the UC Davis study on lab-grown meat's environmental impact is right there at number 5. And so it definitely was a big thing. And so after May 22nd, it is everywhere. And so it is not just in the what I was calling the swamp, all this sort of extremist, politically extreme blogs and stuff like this. It was in, Futurism, the San Francisco Chronicle, Sacramento Bee, the local radio station, Gigazine, Grice, The Independent, Fox, of course, but CNN, CBS, the San Francisco Eater, The Guardian, even the BBC, Bloomsburg, the Sierra Club. It's everywhere. So if you were just a kind of responsible inquirer and you wondered, oh, I wonder what the climate footprint is of this cultivated meat I just heard about, you would think it's 25 times worse than beef, because that's also what's mostly being reported, not any of the subtleties or that. And so you would believe that. And really, it's kind of irreversible too. So many studies have shown that the impact of an article is stubbornly resistant to retraction. The retracted studies average more citations than non-retracted ones. Well, kind of the same thing is happening here. So eventually, the preprint is published. So it's published, its official date of publication is January 2017, 2025. But it still contains its two core controversial assumptions. But a lot of the numbers change. And now that it would be a lot harder to say what that was said in the press release about it, because half of the scenarios show no change or that cultivated meat is better. But now you can then go back and look at the altmetric score and other sorts of things like that. And so for instance, Altmetric reported that the preprint made it into 129 separate distinct news outlets and only 2 for the published version. And so no one's going to have UC Davis isn't going to put out a press release saying, oh, we changed our mind, or we need to lessen what we said before or add less hype. And then, of course, because this is spiraling everywhere in all of these outlets, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them, now, of course, all the LLMs are reading all of this. And so, to my horror, as I'm doing the research for this project, I'm constantly getting this pop-up thing from Gemini saying people also ask, and then I took a screenshot of it, what is the CO2 footprint of lab-grown meat? And then it gives the reasoner numbers, 25 times greater than the median emissions of retail beef. And so I always had to have this on the side on my side, driving me crazy. Um, in a way, it's like the opposite. So Naomi Oreskes and Alex Koroff have a paper, The Afterlife of a Ghostwritten Paper, and it's how a paper that was ghostwritten by Monsanto saying that glyphosate was safe, how even after it was revealed that it was ghostwritten in 2017, it still took until just a few months ago for Wikipedia to take it down. And so when I showed Naomi my stuff, then she said that, yeah, this is like if hers is like the afterlife, then mine's like the prenatal existence of this paper. It has this kind of incredible life. What happened in society? Well, in the swamp, of course, it was everywhere, but then it really goes all over the place because now you don't have to look just at some sort of tweet from Trump's son. You can appeal to articles in major leading newspapers and BBC and stuff like that. And so you see it everywhere in trade associations, especially the Italian one, Coldiretti. There, which is awesome. Calderetti have an article where it's 50 times greater than beef agriculture because they make another assumption to double it, and so they get it even bigger. You can go to websites like labmeat.com, and then you'll find it used to be like 5 tabs all about the Reasoner paper. Now it's a little bit more boring. Um, and then, of course, there's all these right-wing blogs. Will you find that lab-grown cancer is a plot by Bill Gates to make you eat what they call turbo cancer because they call that they because it's sort of a long living cell line. They say it's like cancer, but then they say it is cancer. And anyway, and then so then you can then look at the arguments for now various places take this up for policy. And so then you can look at the arguments that the politicians make in various states and countries for restricting it in some way or even banning it outright. And so you have, people, well, in the kind of swamp, you've got people like at the bottom there, Texas Congressman Ronnie Jackson, who was the former White House physician, warned that if you eat too much cultivated meat, you'll turn into a socialist Democrat. Um, in Florida, in testimony in the House of Representatives, where Florida was the first to ban cultivated meat, even though you can't buy it there. Representative Dean Black said, "Cultured meat is not meat; it is made by man. Real meat is made by God Himself. If you want to try the nitrogen-based protein paste, go to California." And so those are the sorts of arguments that are put forward. And so you have many bands. And so let me see if I 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, so they're happening so fast. So there's two more. So there's eight states now that wait, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Oh, sorry, one more. Wait, who's missing? Every time I give any kind of talk about this stuff, I always have to check because there's always another state or country. But anyway, in eight U.S. states, it's now banned. You cannot buy or sell it. Arizona rejected one recently, but their ban was actually going to be something like a felony. So you'd spend a lot of time in jail if you tried to buy it or eat it or sell it. It's also banned in Italy. And then there's all these other things at the federal level, the School Lunch Integrity Act, which would prohibit the government from putting lab-grown meat, cultivated meat into school lunches, and then the Real Meat Act, which is a labeling one. Um, so you have a lot of action here. There's a lot of other types of restrictions about labeling and that. Um, Now you might wonder, well, surely this weird little paper, life cycle analysis by Reasoner and et al. Did not do that much. No, it definitely did a lot. So, for instance, the Nebraska governor, in an executive order, said, whereas current research suggests that lab-grown meat's environmental impact is significantly higher than naturally grown meat. That was his call for legislator to issue a ban. And you might think, well, where did he get that? And then the answer is quickly comes from the Nebraska Director of Agriculture, Director Sherry Vinton, who says, and UC Davis has a food center there, and they've actually done some research on this, and they found that conventionally raised beef in Nebraska specifically, they said nothing about Nebraska specifically, perhaps would have perhaps a carbon footprint that would be anywhere from 4 to 25 times less than this. Um, and again, you see it again and again. Often, a politician being interviewed or standing up is not giving citations, but it's pretty clear when they're referring to this that they're referring when they refer to the environmental benefits being overstated, that they're referring to the Reasoner study. Um, so Representative Alvarez in Florida could say, you'd be absurdly uninformed, and you would be because you wouldn't have read all of those papers and stuff like this, all saying it's 25 times worse. But it's not just in the US, in the EU. So Italy, and then now just recently Hungary have banned it. And then a group of countries have tried to go to the EU and ban it. And here you can see there's I got a screenshot of their letter, and there you see generating up to 25 times more CO2 equivalents per kilogram of meat compared to genuine meat. And so they're using it. This one's awesome. This is in Australia. It's an inquiry into greenwashing. And the Red Meat Advisory Council accuses environmentalists of disinformation for promoting cultivated meat as being better for climate than regular meat. And then they cite the Reasoner thing. And so they accuse the other side of disinformation, which is awesome. I mean, not awesome, but awesome in a kind of terrible way. And then this was read out loud in Parliament in Western Australia. And so a parliamentarian stood up and read this and read out from the press release itself. And then you can actually see, he read, the article goes on to say, cultured meat across all scenarios, is worse. And, of course, he gets this from the preprint and from the hype in both the preprint at the end and the press release. Okay, so how does all this happen? Well, I don't know if everyone knows the phrase journalism, but that's how it happens. So you have, we could talk about this for a long time, but this is the short version is basically both universities and journalism, they help each other. They both have problems. They've both been widely defunded in much of the world for a long time. And so journalists, there are fewer of them, there are fewer experts, there are fewer adequate checks on content than before. And so they need a copy and they need it fast. Universities are competing more and more with each other, entering into a market more and more. They need research funds. They need students. And so the university press releases are a way to curate their reputation. And so they write the material and then they hand it over to the journalists who willingly accept it because it's already written for a wide public. And, they're trusted sources. And so the other ingredient here are all these distribution platforms. So like Eureka Alerts, Newswise, ScienceX, and so on. And so like UC Davis is a trusted partner of a couple of the distribution platforms, which then means they just push it out immediately into about 1,000 venues. And so that's why you have from May 22nd to May 23rd, it goes so fast into all of those sorts of venues. And basically it doesn't get changed that much. And so people have studied this and it's really kind of jaw-dropping. So there's a study in South Africa that found that half of science media articles there had at least 50% textual similarity to press releases originating from only 4 South African universities. So the press offices of 4 South African universities control more than half really, because it's, if you have 50% textual similarity, maybe if you have 30%, it's still basically a kind of rehashing of the original press release. And so you have a crazy amount of power in the press officer at the universities. Vogler and Schaefer showed that roughly 43% of science newspaper articles originate in university press releases. Comfort et al. Found that up to 65% of news article sentences had high similarity to press releases from universities and think tanks. So you have this incredible amount of power in rehashing everything. Even if you write a paper about this, still your university will rehash it. I mean, we'll press release it. And so Vank had this great study, and then the university press released it. So this has been studied a lot, the hype. And so hype doesn't necessarily mean just exaggeration, but it might mean, omitting, uh, significant limitations and things like that. Well, all this power from the press office would be great if the press offices were selecting things to write about based on academic rigor, significance, accuracy, benefit to the society and whatnot. But, it plainly doesn't. And so you can then look at various papers that show that this really is hype along the pipeline everywhere. And that's true definitely of the UC Davis release, which omitted key limitations, adds unsupported claims about beef's future, and more. And then, of course, there'd be even more reason for concern if press releases from science-related industry organizations were republished in a similar uncritical fashion. Well, that's definitely happening. We know that already from the case I mentioned at the beginning with the Clear Center at UC Davis, which is all funded from the Beef Cattlemen's Association. And so that stuff just goes right through and out through press into press releases. I have many of those press releases where they don't disclose the funding. It goes out, it gets journalized as well. And so you have, a polluted ecosystem. You have all of these little features that are all no one of them sufficient or even maybe necessary, that lead to this polluted epistemic landscape, that lead to really um, potentially bad policy. But this is really terrible because, what the university is being used in this way. But universities have a special role in society. Our mission is the production of, independent information that's useful for the public. And so so something needs to be done. If we didn't know about it before, then we could say we were unwittingly partners with in creating this polluted landscape. But now we see that we are a big part of it, and that we need to do something about it. Well, okay, that's basically this argument. That's basically what I just said. Um, so we have, so it's just especially bad if a knowledge institution does this kind of thing. We shouldn't be complicit in polluting the epistemic landscape. Well, what can we do? Well, I won't spend too much time on this, but I'll just mention two sorts of ways you could go. And then, if you want a draft of the paper or that, I can send it to you. But the idea, so you can basically you could try to solve this. So again, it's not going to solve the big picture, but I think we should do what we can. And so you could have internal solutions or external solutions. Generally speaking, when it comes to universities in the West, when it comes to ethical issues, they have been externally imposed. So people are, used to having to, get consent for experiments and things like that. That was all imposed on universities by the outside funders, in the US by the, NIH. We tend not to, the universities have tended not to aim for the ethical ceiling, but have tended to stick at the floor. Um, So in the absence of action from the universities, a lot of times external forces have arisen. And so in particular, journals have had a lot of conflict of interest rules and also and evolving negotiated rules over many years when you think about how they reacted to the various sins of big pharma and how biomedicine changed and journals changed there in biomedicine. And so one external sort of thing, would be, a kind of what's people talk about in Gelfinger rule, uh, and this is that this is very controversial in biomedicine because it gives the journal first access to the news. But the idea is that you don't press release something until it's been accepted. And so you could do various modifications of this, and I talk a little bit about it in my paper, but not too much. And so you could do so when you go to send your paper somewhere, you have to tick a box that says, it hasn't been press released by my university or anybody. Better, I think, would be internal, the top one. Don't press release material that hasn't been, fix the system internally. So, just make it a rule. Maybe you have some exceptions. That's why I have the little asterisk there for, don't press release material that hasn't been peer reviewed. So maybe, in some cases you might want to have exceptions. So if you think of Jacob's paper on fast science, maybe in public health emergencies, you might want to do that. Although certainly from COVID, we know that has a pretty mixed track record. But anyway, I don't want to, decide those big issues here, but you could certainly make it the case that it's the norm that you don't press release stuff that hasn't been peer reviewed. You could train press officers to always cite the funding, interview those not affiliated with the study, highlight limitations. If you did that, you could sort of test to see what would have happened. So what would have happened had UC Davis not done the press release until after the paper was published? So then they would have had to wait from May 2023 to January 2025. What happened in the meantime? Well, the content of the paper changes, a lot of the numbers change, makes it a lot harder to hype the way they did. Also, the outside world changed. It was now clear that they would be throwing a match into a tinderbox, but also it was it was there was a lot more known about the technology. So the technology behind cultivated meat was then there were a lot more publications, other life cycle analyses, and so it would have been very hard. It wouldn't have stopped them maybe if they were intent on really hyping it up, but it would have made it a lot harder. So conclusion, in cybersecurity, vulnerability mitigation is the practice of reducing the risk of exploitation through known vulnerabilities. Because universities have a mission to provide sound advice to the public, they have a social responsibility to address this vulnerability. And my paper suggests two practicable patches that would help. Thanks. Oh, sorry, and also congratulations again.